Good afternoon. My name is Jacek Stramski. I'm the program co-chair for this event and the immediate past chair of the government lawyer section. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this symposium on restorative justice in criminal practice presented by the alternative dispute resolution section, the criminal law section, and the government lawyer section of the Florida Bar and the Florida Restorative Justice Association. It's very exciting to see so many participants here today. From the bar and bench to spend their Friday afternoon with us engaging in this conversation on restorative justice. I think that's a great testament to the keen interest among members of the bar and those involved in our criminal justice system in developing and implementing those additional tools to better address the complex matters that arise in criminal justice. As you will see today, restorative justice can be a very powerful tool that is already available to practitioners to use in appropriate criminal matters. And by engaging victims and offenders who are ready to face the consequences of their actions in criminal proceedings, restorative justice is one of those rare mechanisms available to us in our adversarial model that can lead to better results for all parties involved. For those of you who are already familiar with restorative justice, I hope today's presentation will be a solid introduction to restorative practices and set you on the path to exploring the possibility of using restorative practices in your professional careers. And for those of you who are already familiar with restorative justice, I hope you end today with practical tools that can help you implement restorative justice measures in your practice or courtrooms in the appropriate cases. And in any event, for everyone, I hope this symposium will be just part of a larger and ongoing conversation on how to integrate restorative justice practices in those cases where it could be most useful. This event is being recorded and will be made available, so please feel free to share with those of your colleagues who were unavailable to attend in real time. And finally, I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists today. We just really have a tremendous group, and I'm very excited to hear this conversation that's about to take place, for sharing their Friday afternoons with us, and for sharing their perspectives that really cover every facet of restorative justice in criminal practice. It's really a great privilege to have you all joining with us today and sharing your experiences with members of the Florida Bar and others. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn over the virtual microphone to Professor Scott Fingerhut of the Florida International University's College of Law and the CLE chair of the criminal law section, who will guide the program today, and without whom this event really would not be taking place. Good effort.
Thank you, Jacek. Good to see you. And welcome again to everybody. As Jacek said, this is being brought to you by the ADR Criminal Law and Government Lawyer sections of the Florida Bar and our co-partner, the Florida Restorative Justice Association. We have, what do we have? Almost 200 of you with us now. There are a couple hundred more of you who have registered, and since we'll be up on the respective section websites when this is done, there will be several thousand Florida lawyers who are going to see this program eventually. And it's a significant program today. So we're very much looking forward to the afternoon together. 3 quick housekeeping matters. Number 1, so you get your credit. Our course number is 4970, 4970. The certificate has been sent to you, everyone who registered, by Jenny Dormany, our Crim Law Section Program Administrator, through whom all wonderful things happen. So you have to sign up for that for yourself, 4970. Number 2, the course materials, a lot of great reference materials, have been emailed to you if you registered. If you haven't received them, or you late registered, or you can't find them, shoot me an email or send Jenny an email, and we'll send them off to you. Third and finally, for housekeeping, if you have any questions at all, use the Q&A function. We'll all see them and work them into our great discussion. So, getting right to it, our first hour for you, we present to you a panel of amazing people to introduce the concept of restorative justice. That panel discussion is going to be moderated by Edith Georgie, who is and was an award-winning 35-year assistant public defender in the 11th Judicial Circuit in Miami. She founded their capital litigation unit, which is significant in and of itself. and she's currently giving back by teaching at St. Thomas and the University of Miami Law Schools. Edith, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I am so honored to be moderating this discussion between three leaders in the field, which will bring a unique insight. To start, before I introduce them individually, I think there's no better way to begin explaining restorative justice than through a vignette of the tragedy of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, where three people, Tim McVeigh, the offender, Bill McVeigh, his father, and Bud Welch, a victim's father, may have changed the path of criminal practice. On that day, April 19th, 1995, Tim McVeigh, as you recall, parked a truck loaded with bomb material in front of the Murrah Federal Building and killed 168 people. A few weeks later, Bud Welch, the father of Julie Welch, who was killed, had seen an image of Bill McVeigh, Tim's father, on television, and he immediately knew that one day he would have to reach out to him. He said, "I saw a deep pain in a father's eyes that most people could not have recognized. I could, because I was also living that pain. And I knew that someday I would go to tell that man that I cared about how he felt." Flash forward 3 years, they met in Mr. McVeigh's backyard and visited for some time. Bud Welch said, "As I walked away from the house, I realized that until that moment, I had walked alone. But now a tremendous weight had lifted from my shoulders, and I had found someone who was a bigger victim of the Oklahoma bombing than myself." And he went on to say that by recognizing the humanity in Bill McVeigh's life and his daughter, he may have been helping them out with their loss. But as Bud explains, "I wasn't doing it for Bill McVeigh, I was doing it for myself. It was a selfish thing on my part, but as it turned out, it worked for all three of us." I think in this panel, you'll see the premise for restorative justice begins in serious criminal cases, begins with the idea that when there is a violent offense, there is a bond formed by the offender and the victim or victims of that offense. Until that bond is addressed completely, or at least addressed in some fashion, healing can't begin. In my experience in many, many trials in the adversary system, I sat as the defense lawyer with all the defense people behind me. The prosecutor sat with all the victims people behind him or her. And there was an invisible line, like a glass shield, that said, "You will not cross this line. You will not interact with the other side." And regardless of the verdict, people went away, but nobody went away healed. So I think that's the premise of where we begin. Let me begin now to introduce our three panelists, and it is truly an honor to do this. They're from three different places, but I'll begin with our first panelist, Donna Coker, professor at Miami Law School, who will teach us Restorative Justice 101. Donna, interesting, emerged from social work into law and has been a tenured professor at Miami for some time. Her area is 20 years, by the way. Her focus is on criminal law, gender and race inequality, intimate partner violence, sexual harm, and the policy and restorative justice responses to that. Her interdisciplinary research spans the fields of critical race feminism, restorative justice, public health, and criminology. For example, in an empirical study of the Navajo peacemaking use in domestic violence cases, this study was one of the first of its kind. This path, in my opinion, reflects a theme we might see throughout, that some of the indigenous communities have traditionally used restorative justice practices long before the current movement began. So while we are learning in the present, we can also learn from the past and from these other communities. Our second panelist is Judge and Professor of Law, Janine Geske from Wisconsin. I think she brings a unique perspective from her years on the bench to her current restorative justice practice. She was a circuit judge for 12 years and then on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, after which she couldn't stop and went on to Marquette Law School as a distinguished professor, where she founded and directed the Restorative Justice Institute. She was twice honored by the Wisconsin Bar as Lawyer of the Year, and also received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the bar. I'd say that the judge and professor is most committed to the restorative justice practices in prisons and beyond, which will be her focus today. And I'm sure she'll bring that home. And our third and another wonderful contributor is Arpana Holavarapu, a professor at the University of South Carolina Law School. There she is. She will give us an introduction into the experience of implementing restorative justice in South Carolina, but her work begins in sub-Saharan Africa, where she investigated and studied domestic violence systems in Uganda. And she came to understand and respect the contributions of community-driven justice practices which she is currently trying to implement or engaged in implementing in South Carolina, based on her experience and exposure. And now the challenge of putting theory into practice. Her perspective should be unique and informative as we move forward. So those are our panelists, and I am delighted to begin now with Professor Coker. So Professor Coker, could you give us an overview of restorative justice today, including whatever history you feel pertinent?
In 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Edith, and I'm very honored to participate on this panel and in this program with these other distinguished speakers, and really excited to see the real serious interest in restorative justice. I guess before I start, I just want to say what I think must be on the minds of all of us here in Florida, and that is that our thoughts and prayers are with the people who are suffering in Sunrise, and I know that's very much on our minds. I wanted to just mention among the readings that we gave you is an APAGA report and also a link to the Florida Justice Association website, both of which are I think will be very useful or very Florida specific. So I am hopefully, yes, excellent. So my focus really today is going to be on restorative justice as a response to harm, and that's what Edith was describing in her intro. It's the most common understanding of restorative justice. It's not the only one. There are restorative processes that are about community building, prevention, education, but that's not what I'll talk about in my short time. The most common institutional setting, I think, is the criminal justice system, but restorative justice is also very much used in education settings and in child welfare and in community settings where it's not at all connected to any sort of institution. Okay, there we go. So I think thinking about restorative justice as a response to harm, it's useful to go to Howard Zer's description. So he compares restorative justice to conventional criminal justice. And in restorative justice, the focus is on who's been harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs. So you see in restorative justice, this focus on both accountability and repair, as Edith was saying. Restorative justice takes seriously the needs of the victim and survivor, and also addresses what Sonia Shaw calls the cause of the cause. So for example, In research looking at restorative justice, intimate partner violence cases in New Zealand, researchers found that in the preparation for restorative justice conferencing, there was frequently a conversation with the person who'd caused harm, who'd perpetrated violence, about his or her own experience of violence and trauma, and the relationship of that experience to the violence that they perpetrated. In youth cases, it's often the case, not only, but in youth especially, cases where there's an ongoing kind of conflict where perhaps one person had hurt another, and then it's when the other person hurts a person that they're caught. And so it's really important to have this opportunity that both holds someone accountable for the harm they caused, and that provides this kind of context, the cause of the cause. So in RJ, we want to identify with clarity and specificity the harm that occurred. We want to give voice to the people who were harmed, redress that harm as much as possible, and forge a plan going forward to prevent that harm from occurring. We might think about restorative justice processes on a continuum. At one end, we might think of what some people would call fully restorative. And in fully restorative processes, you're involving three groups of stakeholders: the victim or survivor, the responsible person, the person who caused harm, the other people in their networks, their family members, other people who are affected by that harm, both of the survivor and of the responsible person, and community members. So I think to maybe put this in some perspective to make this a little easier to understand, I'm going to talk about an example of restorative justice. This is restorative community conferencing. This is a process that was created by Impact Justice. It is the model that the Soul Sisters Collaborative here in Miami has initiated, and they're starting a brand new program in the fall after a successful pre-COVID year of a pilot project. So in Impact, it is a youth sponsored program or a youth focused program. The youth are referred by the prosecution to the restorative justice conferencing program. It is a pre-charge program. There are other kinds of programs. I'll talk in a moment about other ways in which restorative justice enters the criminal system, but this is pre-charge. And so what happens is the program reaches out first to the young person who committed harm. If that person is willing to admit to having engaged in the conduct and wants to be a part of a restorative process, only then would they reach out to the victim to see if the victim too wants to be a part of a process. So restorative justice is not fact-finding about whose fault it was, but it's forward-looking. It's repair, and it's changing behavior and relationships moving forward. So that admission to conduct is critical. If the young person says, "It wasn't me," that's not a restorative justice case. So then what happens after that is that there's a great deal of preparation. It depends on the severity of the harm, and it depends on the context, but there's preparation, and preparation means engaging the family members and others who might take part in a dialogue to help them both understand, manage their expectations for the dialogue, to understand what's likely to happen. It's in that process that there should be a safety check to make sure that that no one is at risk or feels at risk. This is a voluntary process, and it should be a knowing process. The preparation also involves the person who caused harm in preparing that person to be able to listen to very deeply a description of the harm that they caused. And that takes a great deal of preparation sometimes. It may also mean talking with the victim about who it should be in this meeting. So for example, in the article that that you were given, the Vox article by Sujata Balaga, she describes a sexual assault case that occurred in high school. The young woman did not feel comfortable having male members of anyone's family, hers or the person who caused harm, present. She felt embarrassed, and she was able to make that happen. There were only female members in that program. So once the conferencing begins, then in that meeting, it's an opportunity for the person who was harmed to say in his or her own words what happened, what it meant to them, the effects that it's had. With the family members and the other people who care about them also there, they can often fill in the gap, can talk about the changes that they've seen in the person who was harmed. The supporters and the family members for the person who caused harm are there to support that person in taking responsibility and in repair and in moving forward. Out of that, if it's successful, there's a reparative plan, and a reparative plan outlines the steps that the responsible person is going to take. Those steps sometimes incorporate what we might think of as rehabilitation. For example, in some of the restorative justice work with which I'm familiar, it might include alcohol or drug treatment as a part of that. It might include mental health counseling of other kinds, but it also importantly includes repairs to the person who was harmed outside beyond what occurs in that meeting. That could be compensation. It could be other forms of symbolic repair. And in addition to that, it often engages the person who caused harm in changes in the context and the systems that were important in the creation of harm. So for example, again, talking about the sexual harm case that Sujata Balaga writes about, the young person, among other things, then engaged in informative sessions in college about on yes means yes and sexual assault prevention work, engaged in very deep investigation about the origins of sexual harm. So that kind of change in cases involving a DUI, for example, people have engaged in prevention work with youth. If the person,
Warning.
1 minute, oh dear, okay.
I'm
So
sorry.
then that's okay, no charges are filed. So the recidivism research is, and this is described in some detail with the materials that I gave you, shows that recidivism rates decrease with restorative justice use. Interestingly, those recidivism differentials are most profound, are most strongly seen in cases that involve violence. Heather Strang, who's done some of this research, believes that that's because in those cases you have the opportunity for empathy when you're face to face with someone who's been harmed. So I'll skip over this except to just say that the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is this, is that it's really important to have a method to prevent the admissibility of evidence that is developed in the course of a restorative justice response from being used in any sort of criminal procedure following. Sometimes that's a statutory protection, sometimes that's an MOU with the prosecutor.
Thank you. And we'll be able to get back and you can dialogue with the other.
May I say one quick
Sure.
summary thing? And that is, I think that it's really important to think of restorative justice use in response to violence. It's not its only use, but we fail miserably in responding to and preventing violence, and restorative justice can play a very important role in decreasing mass incarceration and addressing the racial injustice of our criminal justice system. So now I'll stop.
Thank you so much, but we'll have dialogue shortly, hopefully. Hello, Professor and Judge Geske.
Hi. Well, I'm thrilled to be with you and with such a distinguished group of panelists, and congratulate the Florida Bar and the various sections for putting this together. Restorative justice is a very important field, and I think it really is a way of addressing a lot of the injustices we have in our system. We've had a long time. I was a circuit court judge, a trial court, general jurisdiction trial court judge before I was on the Supreme Court. And I spent 9 years in criminal court. The last assignment was full-time homicides and sexual assaults. And I have to tell you, as a judge, when people talked about restorative justice, now this is over 20 years ago, I thought, that's nuts. You're going to have to ask survivors of crime to sit down with an offender and have a dialogue. And it really wasn't till I experienced really the gift and the wonderful things that can happen in restorative justice that I started thinking about it differently. And I actually started my work in prisons. And I'm going to take you through a number of examples in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to give you a sense of why I'm so passionate about this work. I started initially, I became director of a program in a maximum security prison, working with about 40 what I would call very serious offenders. I would bring in 3 survivors of violent crimes. They were surrogate survivors, not their survivors, and about 15 to 20 community members, including law students. And for 3 days, we would sit in the circle format and talk about the ripple effect of crime. And my survivors would talk about what happened to them at length for an hour and a half. And you'll get to hear a case study today. But one of the survivors was the widow of a police officer, and talking about the night she found out her husband had been killed and having to tell the children. She tells a story of bursting the ER and having blood all over the room where her husband was bleeding to death. And as she walked out, hearing squeaking noise and looking down and seeing that her bloodied footprints were making a path down the hall. And 20 years later, if she walks across a gym floor, that's a trigger for that her husband's blood. And I can tell you, it is such a profound impact, that little story on the room, that in those 3 days, if one of the men goes outside and comes in with his tennis shoes and they're wet and there's a squeak in the room, we all grow silent, because we all identify with Lynn's story, one of her many stories, about the deep harm that came about when her husband was basically assassinated. Another survivor that comes and talks is a sexual assault survivor. And she not only talks about being raped and pregnant, but what it was like to have the gun at her head, and how that has influenced her life, and how she felt having somebody holding her life in his hand, and how years and years later it impacted how she raised her children, what her relationships were like. And what would happen after the women would tell the stories, or the other survivors, the men would tell their survivors. And all of you that do criminal law know that the men and the women in our criminal justice system who have the title offender are very often survivors and victims themselves. And so they often will start sharing their stories of seeing their mother shot before them, or lying next to their brother being killed, or being assaulted by a family member. And to have that deep discussion leading to some healing at the end of the 3 days was just transformational for me. I then became involved in victim offender dialogues and crimes of severe violence. I've done many cases involving homicides, sexual assaults, armed robberies, and other violent crimes. And, you know, those are the ones I thought no victim or survivor would want to do that. But I was wrong. I was dead wrong. There are lots of survivors that sometimes 20 years after the crime want to sit down with the person that took their loved one's life and say, what were his last words? Was there a struggle? What were you thinking? What do you do on the anniversary of the homicide? And they find, by having that dialogue and having incredible remorse expressed by somebody who took someone's life, that they find healing in that process. I've never had a survivor go through that and regret going through that process. And for the offenders have told me that is the best thing they've ever done in their lives, to take responsibility, to acknowledge what they did, and also to ask to apologize as much as they possibly can. The intoxicated by homicide, and homicide by intoxicated user is a very common one, that's because often the defendant has no prior record. And of course, the family is decimated by the loss of a loved one. And to have the offender or the individual who's been convicted of that crime or is in the criminal justice system on that crime, hear the incredible harm, but also for the family to hear the taking of responsibility, which does not happen well in our courtrooms. I want to just mention a juvenile case that a friend of mine was involved in. And it's, it's sort of the other end of the spectrum. Some kids were tagging or putting graffiti on cemetery stones, a crime that doesn't make any sense, but happens. And the mother of somebody who was buried below one of those stones was willing to meet with a young man who was about 14 years old. And as she talked to him, she told him her 14-year-old son was buried in that spot. And she had an 8x10 photo that this young kid had to look at and said, that's where I go to visit my son. He'll never be 15. He'll never be 16. And now you have decimated my holy place for visiting my son. The kid had tears running down his cheek, was trying to volunteer. What can I do to help? Can I help keep the gravesite clean? And all I can think of when I hear that story is what would have happened if he'd gone to the juvenile system instead? The judge would have put him on probation, ordered restitution, and he would have walked out of the courtroom with no idea of the harm that he had caused. In Milwaukee County, we've had a restorative justice unit in our district attorney's office probably for over 15 years. I've been doing the work for 20, and I think early on they started the program, and they do community conferencing. It's a different model. Donna did a wonderful job in 10 minutes trying to tell you all the things that can happen, but the community conference involves community members who sit in a circle, and if a survivor or victim wants to participate, they do. And they use it a lot for what we often call quote unquote victimless crimes. For example, the delivery of a controlled substance for a 17-year-old in Wisconsin is a felony, adult felony. But to put a kid like that into a community circle where the community can say, talk about the problems of drug dealing, talk about the neighborhood problems, talk about the impact that all this has, their daughters and sons who are addicted. And then as a group to talk to that young man about, or the young woman, about what they expect him to do to try to help repair the harm, whether it's volunteer work, whether it's get a high school diploma. And if he or she goes through those steps, the district attorney's office has agreed that they will either reduce the charge or dismiss the charge. And so that person can walk away not only improved and having learned something because of the case, but also to hopefully be, somebody who doesn't return to the system. In Madison, Wisconsin, there is a restorative justice court, and it's in a neighborhood made up primarily of minorities, and it has a lot of young men as the perpetrators, although they're young women as well. And there the judges, the district attorney, the police refer people to that court before they've ever been charged. So there's no entry on their record of an arrest. And they're put into that court in the same concept of trying to hold them responsible, to have them accept accountability, but also to do things, whether it's volunteer work, whether it's get an education, whether it's get a job. Often the community members will help the young man or woman get a job. And so it's this community effort to try to turn that person around.
Okay, thank you so much. And we'll get back to you after
Hard to do in 10 minutes, right?
You did perfect. You were right on time. Professor Polavarapu, tell us about your journey from sub-Saharan Africa into restorative justice in South Carolina, or any way you want to describe it.
Sure, thank you.
In 10 minutes, please.
Yep, 10 minutes, gotcha. So yeah, most of my work up to this point, up to a few years ago, has really been in other countries. I come at this from my work doing human rights work in other countries, especially. And because of the countries I work in, I've had a lot of exposure to informal systems of justice, right? I work in a lot of countries that are characterized by legal pluralism, which is defined as one or more legal traditions operating in the same space. And I also, like, personally being Indian, have some sort of also cultural ties to some more restorative approaches. But what I saw over time was that these non-state approaches that often have restorative elements that were like so aptly described by Donna, really were just better at providing the parties involved with what they were looking for, right? What they were asking for and what they were stating as their needs than the state approach. How did I get to doing this in South Carolina? Well, I had been thinking for a while that I thought that there was some application in South Carolina. And so I wanted to do the academic thing. And I was like, I'll have some speakers come and we'll have a conference and people will learn. And as I talked to more and more people around the state, I realized that people were hungry for much, much more. Right. So that led to the creation of the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. Now, who was I talking with? I was talking with attorneys, so defense attorneys and solicitors, but also the strongest voices in my conversations were actually people who were serving survivors and victims advocates. So, the statewide coalition against domestic violence and sexual assault, members of that coalition were telling me, the people we serve, we have a large number of them who don't want the state option, right? Who don't want what we can offer through the state legal system, often the criminal system. And they're looking for something like this. And we're also seeing how we're not really adequately serving them. The rates of partner violence in South Carolina are just among the worst in the country. Right. And so even the judges and the attorneys on both sides who are watching this go through the courts were like, we're not making a dent. Right. So we've got to try something. And I just yesterday had a phone call with the Victims Advocate Network, and they said the same thing. We have so many clients who want this other option. Right. So we're working hard through SCRJI to support the development of those practices. We take a three-prong approach. It's still very new in South Carolina. The first thing we're doing is educating. This is really new for a lot of people. So I think it takes a lot of exposure and a lot of just reteaching. Here's what this is. Here's how it looks like in different contexts. Here's how different people implement restorative practice. So, Donna did a great job of going through some of the principles and the shift in mindset that you have when you're engaging in restorative practice, but in practice, it can look a number of different ways while still holding true to those principles and like those animating questions. We're promoting research and also supporting organizations who are interested in developing their own practices. And we actually are supporting the development of restorative practices both within and outside the criminal system. So we just came off of a workshop, skills workshop for people in the education system. Some of you all might remember that video that went viral of the school resource officer grabbing a young Black girl by her hair and throwing her, and that was here in South Carolina. In the aftermath of that, an organization called Every Black Girl was formed. And so we partnered with Every Black Girl to begin teaching interested administrators and students how they can engage in restorative practice in schools as community building, as prevention, but also as conflict resolution. We are currently in the early stages of proposing a restorative practice to support people who are involved in partner violence, at the request of, like I said, people who are, those who are providing services for survivors of violence and also people in the court system. So we're working on developing a diversion program, as well as a practice that is available for all of those survivors and current victims who want a way out, but are absolutely adamant that they're not going to go through the police or the state in any way. And then we're also working with people who are working with the juvenile system to find ways, and we're actually looking at impact justice. So I was really glad to see that referenced as a model, right, for options for our youth here. So I'll say this, I mean, South Carolina is maybe not the first state people think of when they think of restorative justice, but there is tremendous interest, there's tremendous understanding that we need to be doing more. And I think probably what's driving it the most is the fact that it's being requested, right? It's being requested by the people who have suffered harms, who do not see relief, who do not feel relief or experience relief by going through a process that is putting them in front of courts and giving them outcomes that isn't giving them anything, right? It's not giving them the healing maybe that they need. It's not giving them the outcomes they want to see, right? A number of people have also expressed to me that what they really want to see is some, they want some assurance that this isn't going to happen again. And they're not seeing that as a possibility in the current system, whereas they are. And also for a number of people, it's really important to just be able to talk to the person who hurt them. To say, like, I need you to know what you did to me, and to not be bound by rules of evidence, to be able to tell that full narrative, regardless of, the theory of the case that's being presented, regardless of whatever strategy you have going into court, regardless of rules of evidence, just to be able to tell that whole story from beginning to end. So all of those things, I think, are really driving the development of restorative practice here. And I see I'm watching the time, so I know my time's almost up, but I'm just going to end here. I don't come from a criminal law background. My background is in human rights, which does often intersect with criminal practice because criminalization is often a key recommendation for the harms that people in my field are concerned about. But really what drove me to this space was concern for the people who are involved in the system on both sides. And the very clear statements, from beginning to end, again, on both sides, from all parties, that the state system was just not what they wanted, right? The criminal system was not what they wanted, that they had something else in mind that they were seeking. And I saw this, again, not just in Uganda and other countries, but I come to South Carolina and I'm hearing the same exact things, the same exact sentiments. And so it's really turning into a movement. I'll say that. I think that there's some real development here and real push to try to find better outcomes, to try to find ways to get people, reintegrated into the community. And of course, we also have one of the higher incarceration rates in the country to work on that as well.
So let me pose one of our questions to you, please. And this says, domestic violence has at its core power and control of the perpetrator. How can having the victims sit across from him constitute a meaningful dialogue? And I'd love to hear all of you weigh in on that. How can putting these two or how many people together ever be a meaningful dialogue? I think that's what's hard for people to chew on.
I guess I can start. First of all, no one's forced into this, and I think that that's really important to acknowledge. I think people are imagining someone being pushed into a situation that they don't want to be in. There are a number of survivors who want this, who ask for this. I do think it is incumbent upon the facilitator to make sure that it is a safe enough space to have meaningful dialogue and to avoid replicating any power imbalances. And I'll just say one thing just to make sure everyone has a chance to weigh in on this, but there was a conferencing program that was implemented in South Africa that brought together, that was in response to partner violence. And a qualitative study that was done with survivors after those conferences found that pretty much all of the survivors who were interviewed said, this really provided me with the space that I needed to get through what I needed to say to my partner, right? Because when I was at home, if I had said this, I was at risk of being battered or beaten. but you have created a safe space. And I knew that I would be able to tell like that full story, beginning to end, exactly what I needed to say. And that was really, really meaningful for me. So that was a pretty common response in those conferences. I mean, it's not the only thing you're looking for. And so they also looked for change in behavior afterwards, what the agreements were. And all those outcomes came out
right.
positively as well. But just to respond to this particular question, right,
Yeah.
one of the most important things for the participants was that they be given that safe space. And these particular facilitators did a really great job.
Okay,
great.
and as the other two panelists, I don't mean to cut you off, but as the other two panelists weigh in on this, you might also address the next question, which is how to get the stakeholders to buy into this, which you've already just led into, but whoever wants to go next, Janine or Donna.
Sure. You know, there are a lot of models now in the world on addressing domestic violence. I've been involved in domestic violence issues for probably 30 or 40 years. And I have to say a lot of advocates for women or those who have been survivors of domestic violence are very interested in restorative justice. That didn't used to be true. And part of it is, you know, the fact that for most of the cases that come into the system, and all the criminal defense lawyers and prosecutors know this, they wind up getting dismissed. The survivors don't go ahead with it. The individual who's responsible was able to drop out. And so most of those cases never go to conviction. And what happens then is everybody goes back home and meets in a bar or meets somewhere in a non-safe community. And so to be able to facilitate a dialogue in a safe environment. But what's critical is that you have really trained facilitators who understand the dynamics of domestic violence. Some cases, people use surrogates. So they put somebody who is convicted of a battery along with a survivor, but not his survivor. So they can have a dialogue first. I've done circles with some survivors in a domestic violence program for those who've been convicted. And so there are lots of models people are trying out. You know, as you just heard, it's critical that it be a safe environment. But it has to be something that parties want. You never want to force anybody into this process. But frankly, I think that the alternative often is just going back home and reuniting, and that usually leads to more problems.
Thanks. And Donna, as you address this, maybe you also want to tack on your final takeaway.
Well, most of the research, almost all of the research I do is about the use of restorative justice in intimate partner violence and sexual harm. I mean, that is what I focus on primarily. And so let me just, and I agree with everything my co-panelists say. Let me just add two more things. One of the great benefits I saw when I first did research in the Navajo Peacemaking Court's treatment of intimate partner violence, and have seen in other restorative justice processes, is that there's a real opportunity to interrupt the social supports for controlling behavior. So when you have family networks in the room, and remember that there's a screening process that happens before any of those people come into the room. In other words, the facilitator in collaboration with the survivor can say, not that guy. You know, he's not, that grandpa's not coming in because he's a main instigator, right? But you can interrupt those kinds of networks of support. For example, as I mentioned, talking about the transmission of intergenerational violence, right? This is what happened to my mother. This is what happened in the family I grew up in, and unearthing that can really change the whole dynamic, so that you have sometimes the family members of the person who caused harm becomes a real supporter of the victim because they want to change that dynamic. They don't want this to continue. So that would be one thing. And we've seen that. We see it in the research on New Zealand's program, where they are seeing intimate partner violence routinely. I recently did comparative research and looked at European countries where, again, intimate partner violence is seen routinely. So we have a lot of research on this, which I'm really happy to share. The other thing too, though, is to recognize, in my view, that there's a real continuum on intimate partner violence. So you referenced the power and control model, and that describes some kinds of intimate partner violence. But in fact, the research, I think, shows that there's quite a continuum. And not all experiences of intimate partner violence look like that kind of coercive control, to use a different kind of language. And so it's really, and a lot of our models, our domestic violence court models, are based in that kind of extreme, and then don't do well by that whole range. So I think that restorative justice is useful in the whole range of the kinds of violence that you see. Go ahead.
One quick question, since we're in Florida. We see such a range from Colorado to Wisconsin to South Carolina. Where does Florida stand on the scale? How would you describe where we are in implementing any of these practices?
Not well developed. So there are restorative justice programs. The OPAGA report really tells you what is going on in Florida, but there are restorative justice programs in various pockets in the state. There's no sort of really systematic organizing of restorative programs. Some of the restorative justice is happening in what I would call a one-off. In other words, you have a prosecutor, or you have a victim who asks for it, or you have a defense attorney, and then there are people who are able to do that. I don't mean to say it's all that way, but some of it is that way. There are programs like River Phoenix, for example, and a number of other youth programs in the state. And I mentioned Soul Sisters Collaborative, which is starting a youth program for girls, and that will launch in the fall. But compared to those states in which, like Colorado, we're not well developed. There are programs in some of the school systems, but again, not throughout and not systematically. We could do a great deal more.
If I could just jump in, because I didn't have a chance to say this, the United States is behind the rest of the world on this. We are not a leader. And I know all of us have been involved in international. I've done training in Turkey. I've done training in Ireland. And I have to say, every EU country has restorative justice. Belgium, every case is deserving of restorative justice. I went to a conference in Iran 2 years ago on restorative justice. And so Canada has been way ahead of us for a long time. Jamaica, I've been working with judges down there. They have incredible system that they're trying to implement, but the language and sort of the framework is terrific. So even though, states may be lagging, we can look around the world and see very strong programs.
Might have something to do with our mass incarceration rate.
Well, very much. And I was just going to say, I would just add to that there are a number of indigenous programs in the U.S. That are far more advanced than really a lot of what states are doing. So the Navajo Nation peacemaking is just one example of those.
Thank you. Aparna, any takeaway you'd like to end with?
I feel like Janine and Donna really aptly said most of what I would want you all to take away. But I guess I'll end with this. I understand that it's hard, even when something sounds interesting, to embrace it, because it is different and requires you to dismantle a couple of the ideas that you've been trained in your whole lives, right? So I think that this is worth just further research. Like, we barely scratched the surface. There's so much out there. There's so much you can learn from. So I'd really, really encourage y'all to take the time to keep reading and watching and listening. I mean, it comes in all formats now, video, podcast, articles, because I think, you'll really see there's a reason why so many other countries are really embracing this, and why so many cultures held on to it, right, in spite of the prevailing influence of our model. And it's because it really can have some great results and help us move in a positive direction that we should all be looking for.
I think our next panel is going to pick up on that, right away. Thank all of you so much for your participation. It was wonderful to see you. And I guess we're going to go dark now.
Well,
Thank
just
you.
hold on a sec.
Thanks, Scott.
One, obviously, thank you for that. A full day wouldn't be enough for any of our presenters to have. There were interesting questions, questions about university application, Title IX application, whether the Florida Department of Corrections is at all on board on this, which we're going to explore a little later in opening victim and offender dialogues. So if any of the 200 plus people who are with us now want to reach out with any questions, right, do you encourage contact, or are you going to destroy me for suggesting that?
I absolutely encourage contact. I'm easy to find, dcoker@law.miami.edu, or look me up on the website. And I have a 2-page resource list on restorative justice for intimate partner violence and sexual harm, which I'm happy to share. So, and part of it addresses Title IX and restorative justice on campus. So I'm really happy to talk to anybody about any of this.
And maybe it's time for a follow-up conversation, which got interrupted by COVID last year.
Well, let me say, I also,
Yes,
you can find me through Marquette University Law School. You know, I once had an entire Marquette basketball team and their coaches in a circle along with 3 survivors of acquaintance assault as they told their stories. And so they're creative uses of it. I also have 2 films, one Restorative Justice Circle on trauma in criminal kinds of neighborhoods, and another one on healing in the Catholic Church. So I'm happy to share that if people want to reach out.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be great.
Likewise, you can reach me. I think I'm the only Aparna Polavarampu in South Carolina. So if you lose everything else, you can just Google me and write South Carolina at the end of it, and I'll pop up.
There was one comment in the questions, Professor, about why is South Carolina any odder a jurisdiction than another?
Oh, I mean, it's just when I mention it, people seem really surprised. So that's just sort of the reaction I expect these days.
There were several smart, interesting comments in the questions as well about how well prepared the folks need to be once you have the stakeholders before you get to the table, because things can fall apart and the victim can feel re-victimized by an unprepared gathering. And I assume that resonates with the 3 of you.
Let me jump in on a victim offender dialogue and a crime of severe violence. 6 months to a year of preparation before we put them together.
Wow.
So
yeah, I think it's really important to take the time to do this well. And that's why we're working really hard to make sure that the people who are interested get the skills they need, that they are taught that there's a lot of work they need to do this well. The thing that I really hate to see is that people see there's interest in restorative justice and then they slap the label on something that looks pretty much the same as the stuff they were doing before.
And if Professor Coker, just to close this out, if you could comment briefly, there was an excellent question relating to your mentioning of the offender admitting to the conduct and whether there's a distinction between confessing, admitting to a crime versus admitting to the conduct, and which stakeholder or holders need to be on board for that, so that does not spiral out of control.
I can always tell when I'm talking to lawyers and when I'm not, right? So yeah, that was an intentional choice. So the most programs require the person who is alleged to have committed the harm to admit to the conduct, not necessarily to the crime, not necessarily to the mental state, for example, or any other kinds of elements, but rather that, yes, it was me, and yes, I did that. And part of that, yeah.
So in your experience, do the evidence code provisions, which say things we're going to talk about in plea negotiations, aren't usable, or are we going to need?
Yeah.
Or are we going to need legislation and rulemaking and?
Well, so a lot of programs, I mentioned the RCC, have an MOU with the prosecutor. And what that MOU provides in the strongest form is that the prosecutor agrees that no charges will be filed, not only against the responsible person, but against anyone who is participating in the restorative justice process, and including any statements that are made in the preparatory phase, in the meeting phase, and in the follow-up phase. And that's really important with youth, particularly important with youth, because you may find that you have one person who was arrested, but you actually have a number of youth who are engaged in criminal kind of behavior. And so if you don't offer that, if you don't privilege those conversations, if you don't have immunity for those conversations, then you are potentially doing tremendous harm.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
that's really critical. Mediation statutes might cover some of this. So it hasn't been tested as far as I know in court, but it's presumed to be so. Some states have particular provisions around restorative justice. The problem with those statutes, Talia Gonzalez let me just throw that in, has a great article.
Wrap this up if you could.
Okay, but the problem with that is very frequently the statute will define restorative justice in a very narrow way.
All right. Well, to Edith, professors, Your Honor, thank you for this. Obviously, the conversation will continue. Let's break until 2:10. Let's take an 8-minute break. Don't miss what's coming next. See you in 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, our next hour is really why we're all here. We called it a case study, but they are really so much more than that. The Gromers and the McBrides. This will be a discussion for you that will be moderated by Kelly McGrath, who's a family lawyer, who is certified by the Florida Supreme Court as a family law mediator, and is the founder of the Florida Restorative Justice Association, our partner in presenting this to you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I really have the honor of introducing my friends now, the people I heard on a panel like this about 7 years ago or 8, and inspired me. I knew nothing about restorative justice, inspired me to learn about it, become a facilitator, and ultimately found the Florida Restorative Justice Association. So I'm so humbled and grateful they're here today. Let me introduce them quickly. Julie McBride has been teaching the joys of art for a number of years to the Tallahassee, Florida community as an education or elementary art instructor, and now as an adjunct professor. So thank you, Julie, for being here. And Michael McBride is a senior database administrator at the Florida Department of Transportation. Thank you so much, Michael. And Andy Gromer is the Chief of Enforcement with the Florida Office of Financial Regulation for the state of Florida, and is a permanent deacon in the Catholic Church with the serving the Diocese of Pensacola through Tallahassee. So thanks so much, Andy. And Kate is a business analyst with the Florida Department of Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And she also authored a book of her experience, Forgiving My Daughter's Killer, a true story of loss, faith, and unexpected grace. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to the panel this time. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to start. Our story began about 11 years ago on March 28th in Tallahassee, Florida. Most of you know, if you live in Florida, that it's pretty warm. It was Palm Sunday. It was a pretty warm day. And so Andy and I had spent the afternoon in the garden. He does the flowers and I do the fruits and vegetables. And we came in pretty hot and dirty, and each went to go wash up, and our doorbell rang. Well, we're sort of in rural Leon County, and no one ever comes to our door. So I was upstairs. I threw a sundress on and I ran down to the front door. At the same time, Andy came to the front door, and we basically opened it at the same time. On the other side was a woman dressed with a black skirt and a white blouse, and a woman standing behind her in the uniform of a deputy sheriff for Leon County. And the Leon County sheriff's car was in our driveway. Quite a surprising thing to see on the other side of your door. She asked us if we were Ann Gromer's parents, and we said yes. And they asked if they could come inside. The one woman identified herself as the victim's advocate for the Leon County Sheriff's Office. And quite honestly, I thought, okay, if she's the victim's advocate, that's got to be a good thing, right? So when they sat us down, she told us that Ann had been shot. I couldn't wrap my head around that. I didn't know what that meant. She works in a baby boutique. And I thought, who would rob a baby boutique? It's just this little store. And then I realized that it was Sunday and the store wouldn't have been open. And so I asked, was Connor with her? Connor McBride was her boyfriend of 3 years, and they had recently planned on getting married at some point in the future. So sometimes she's referred to as his fiance. And the deputy sheriff said, Connor McBride? And I said, yes. And she said, he's the one who shot her. again, how am I supposed to process that information? Connor, was her boyfriend. I would have expected him to, be taking care of her, to be with her. And he, at the time, was living in an apartment with other young men who were going to Tallahassee Community College. And I thought somebody must have gotten a gun out and were playing around. And, in my head, it was a minor injury that she would certainly recover from. The victim's advocate told us that she was there to get us to the hospital safely. And we realized that we would probably need our car. So we chose to follow them rather than ride with them to the hospital. Once we got there, we waited for the doctor to come out. And when he finally did, he told us that Anne had been shot through the right eye with a shotgun. Now, I know enough about shotguns to know that it's a bunch of pellets that get sprayed out, and I couldn't quite understand how she could be shot through the right eye, but it was at close range, and the doctor said she was in grave condition, and it was a miracle that she was alive. He took us back to see her, and she had her entire head bandaged. I couldn't even recognize her until I saw a freckle on her hand. And that's when I knew, because I couldn't tell from her face. Well, they took her up to the neurointensive care unit, and it was clear to us from the very beginning that she would not survive her injuries, and that it was just a matter of time before decisions would have to be made. We called our family and friends, and everybody came up to the hospital and were so supportive of us during that week. And by Thursday, they were telling us that her organs had begun to fail and that we would need to take her off life support. So we made the decision to do that on Friday. In the meantime, the McBrides had come up to visit us, and they told us that Connor had put me on his list to come visit him at the Leon County Jail. And I don't know why, but I felt this obligation, since he could only put 4 people on his list, that I would go see him. I asked Andy what message he wanted me to take to Connor. And strangely, but maybe not so strangely, if you know our faith background, we had both separately come to a place where we had forgiven Connor for shooting Anne. And so he told me to tell Connor that he loves him and forgives him. And I thought to myself, yeah, I want to say that too. I want to say that too. Michael?
Michael, you're muted.
Well, let's start that again. Sorry. This tragedy began for us right at the start of spring break. We had just gone to the beach. We were at the Target in Destin so Grandma could get our daughter Katie a baby doll. I got a phone call from Private, and I thought, I don't know anybody who would ever have a phone number of Private. And so I didn't answer it. When I called up to Julie, she was on the phone, mouth open, ashen white. It was a detective with Leon County Sheriff's Department who told Julie that Connor had shot his fiance in our house and then turned himself into the Tallahassee Police Department. The detective said they were having an argument outside our house, and Connor went back inside, loaded my shotgun with 1 shell to take his own life. But in the ensuing interaction, Connor shot Anne. We left Target pretty much in shock. Since we had come in 2 cars, we knew I could go on back home right away. As I collected my things, Julie called that detective back, who with great kindness explained what was in store for Connor the following few days and for us. It turned out that she was a mother of a 19-year-old son also. It was our first example of how much this tragedy impacts the community. And it was also our introduction to the caring professionals in law enforcement that we would encounter along the way. As I left for home, Julie was worried about me driving in such a state of shock. So she told me she loved me, to drive carefully, and to go to the hospital. Once in town, I went to Tallahassee Memorial Hospital and up to intensive care. The hall and the waiting room were packed full of people. Kate and Annie Gromere were across a sea of people. I felt like a cartoon character shrinking in a place I did not belong. I remember standing up against the wall, breathing deeply to stem the nausea when a lady came up to me and said, "Are you Connor's dad? You look just like him." It turned out she was Connor's supervisor, and I have subsequently learned that she went up to Andy and specifically said, "There is someone here to see you." Andy Gromere made his way across the crowd, hugged me, and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Thank you for being here, but please do not be offended if I hate you by the end of the week." All I could say was, "I'm so sorry." After some conversation that I was too much in shock to hear, I was introduced to Father Michael Foley. He prayed for us. He prayed for Anne and for Connor. He prayed for the Gromeres and for all families impacted by this. It was another consummate sign of the community impact of this tragedy. No parent should ever have to go through first appearance, a brief but incapacitating dunking in the judicial system, a system I felt I never needed to know about, a system in which we soon found ourselves swept away. The one good thing about that first appearance is I asked one person in the courtroom who looked approachable how the process worked. It was Greg Cummings. I told him my son was in trouble, and he said, "I hope it's not the boy on the front page of the paper." After first appearance was over, we talked, and I told him that we could not visit Connor because he was in suicide watch in the jail. He said he could go as a legal representative and see how Connor was doing. And he did, and we met in the jail parking lot. And that's where we hired him as Connor's defense lawyer.
After Michael went to the hospital that first night, we both went together each night to visit with Anne. And on Thursday night, we brought our special needs daughter, Katie, who had made Anne a card. And Katie put her hand on Anne's hospital bed and she sang to her and she prayed to her. That really set the foundation for us to move forward as two sets of parents impacted by a similar tragedy. And having that interaction between the parents of the victim and the family of the offender provided for restorative discourse right from the very beginning. Kate?
So Friday morning, I decided that I would go see Connor. We also had decided Thursday that Friday would be the day that we took her off life support. And I chose to go see him that morning because I honestly did not want to be the one to tell him that Anne had died. So Julie had given me some instructions on how to go. You know, you don't take anything in but a key and some identification. And I went up to the desk and told them my name and that I was there to see Connor McBride. And she looked at my driver's license and she looked at the computer and she looked at my driver's license and she looked at the computer. And she said, "Are you the victim's mother?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Can you step aside for a minute?" I said, "Yes, I can." And after a few minutes, a deputy sheriff came out and she said, "You are on his list and you do have your identification. So we're going to let you go up and see him. But we don't want you to pound on the windows." And I told her, I said, "I'm not here to pound on the windows." So I walked down the long hall and up the elevator and down another long hall. And I'm sure every step that I took was videotaped and watched by people that were there. And I sat down and waited for Connor to come. And when he came, he already had tears in his eyes, and he sat down and he told me, he said, I am so, so, so sorry. And I told him, Connor, Mr. Gromer wants me to tell you that he loves you and he forgives you. And Connor, you know I love you and I forgive you. And I meant those words when I said them, and I mean them to this day. And this particular talk is not about our forgiveness of Connor. We can share that at another time, but we wanted this focus to be on our the justice experience, the restorative justice experience that we had.
So we have forgiven Connor, and what were we supposed to do next? We felt some obligation toward him. And so I felt obligated that maybe, I'd already heard state prison was a pretty awful place. And so I thought, well, maybe if we could advocate for him to go to some place that was more gentle, like a faith character-based person, that would be, feeling like I had done something, that I acted out my forgiveness. And so we searched for a restorative justice person, because I'd heard about that through a person called Allison DeFore, a person who we met, who was recommended to us. And he said, restorative justice is all about what you and Catholic people do. Why don't you do that? Well, at the time, as you heard earlier, I was in formation to be a deacon for the Catholic Church. I felt really embarrassed because I'd never heard of it. And so here's this guy telling me that I'm supposed to know all about it. So I went out and did some research, and it was amazing. It was just the things that it offered was something that I felt like I could have a voice into what was happening. And I wasn't just supposed to sit on the side and do nothing and let the criminal justice system dictate everything what I was supposed to do. So I reached out and tried to contact people, by Googling restorative justice and finding out about it, and potentially practitioners. I kind of really struck out everywhere. And so Michael and I were having lunch together on a regular basis, because I realized Michael and me shared a connection that no one else did. We each had a child that was impacted by this tragedy, and I felt a kinship toward him. So we reached out. I reached out and I really kind of struck out. So I told Michael about it. And, Michael, the best thing that he did was he told Julie. Well, Julie's quite the dynamo. And so she did her own research and went straight to the top to a person named Howard Zierer, who's the grandfather of restorative justice.
Now, in the meantime, we had already met with the state attorney, the assistant state attorney, Jack Campbell, who now is the state attorney for District 2 in Florida. And he was the prosecuting attorney in the case. We thought that Connor would get 10, 20 life based on, we thought he would get life in prison based on the 10, 20 life sentencing for gun crimes, because he had killed someone in the commission of a felony with a gun. But what we found out was that wasn't necessarily true, that if he went to trial and was convicted, then the judge would have to follow those guidelines. But when we were talking to Jack Campbell, Jack said, I have a lot of leeway in how I charge Connor. He said, I could charge him with manslaughter and give him 5 years. And I said, what? And he said, no, I would never do that, but I could. He was kind of showing us that, he was very much in control of the situation. And, he said, you don't have to worry about anything. I will be Anne's advocate in the court. Well, Andy took a little umbrage to that, because, he's been her father for 19 years. And he was her advocate. We were her advocate. And we didn't want the criminal justice system to take everything away from us. They said they didn't want to go to trial because they didn't want us to have to testify, but we still got a subpoena. So I didn't quite understand what they were really protecting us from. Plus, we wanted to be involved in the process. And so when he told me that Connor could be charged with manslaughter and only served 5 years, it was like, what do we want? What do we want for Connor? And honestly, for me, I wanted it to make a difference. For Connor to spend the rest of his life sitting in a jail cell, doing nothing for the rest of his life, or for 40 years, or for however long that was, that didn't satisfy the debt that he owed us. He owed a life. And so what was the point of virtually taking that life in return? For me, it would be better if he could serve half his term behind bars, and then the rest of his term be spent doing community service in the areas that Ann would have, to speak to people about teen dating violence, to take anger management classes, because what good would it do to release him in 40 years and have him still be as angry as he was when he went in? Those were the things that were important to me, and those were the things that weren't going to happen in the traditional justice system. Julie?
Well, as Andy said, I did reach out to Howard Zier, and I caught him returning home from Germany. He said that he would contact 2 restorative justice lawyers that he knew. Connor, as I mentioned, has a sister, Katie, who was 17 at the time. And while I was waiting in my car in the parking lot of waiting for her ballet lesson to finish, I received a call from Sujatha Balaga of Oakland, California. And she was calling, much later I discovered, to tell me very gently that this would never happen and that it had never been done before, especially in Tallahassee, the capital of a punitive state like Florida. I happened to mention that the fathers, Michael and Andy, were having lunch each week, and she stopped me and she said, "Wait, what, they're talking?" And I said, "Yes." And she said first she had to talk to Andy and Kate. And if they call her and agree to a circle, she said she would let me know. So I called Kate. She immediately called Sujatha. And in the space of a ballet lesson, the restorative justice circle process was started, with Sujatha agreeing to be the facilitator. Kate and Andy?
We contacted Sujatha about November of 2010, the year that Ann was shot, and the circle ended up being scheduled for June of 2011. So she had 6-7 months to work with everybody, and she was so careful about everything that was going to happen in the circle. She called us one time very trepidatious and said, "I have to tell you something." And we're like, "Okay, what?" And she said, "In order to be able to have access to the evidence, I need to become a member of the defense team. I'll be an expert on restorative justice." She said, I want it to be clear that I'm not here to defend Connor. I'm here as the facilitator, but I need to do this in order to have access. And of course we were fine with that. And so, then we settled on doing a restorative justice circle, and she led us through the process. She asked question after question after question to make sure that everything that we wanted, that it would happen the way that we wanted it to. I remember one of the questions she asked, was like, who do you want to walk in first? And I'm like, why would someone walk in first? And she said some people might like that, and it didn't matter to me. And then she said, "Do you want Connor to be shackled?" And I just couldn't speak for a minute, and she very patiently waited for me to respond. And I said, "I don't want him shackled." I mean, the whole purpose of coming together in this restorative justice circle was to be there as human beings, as people relating to one another, and to have Connor shackled when he came into the room just was not at all what our purpose was. We had a meeting with Greg Cummings, Allison DeFore, Sujatha, the McBrides, the Gromares. It's I think around March, to decide how exactly we wanted this to go. And since Sujatha was from California, she wanted to understand how the Florida criminal justice system worked and how we could have this restorative justice circle. And it was Allison DeFore who suggested the pre-plea conference. And I know Kelly can tell us at the end of this what exactly that statute is that allows for that. But as it was discussed a little bit before, it does allow Connor to be present, allows anybody to be present in the pre-plea conference. And Connor is protected when he speaks. Basically, to put it simply, he could say he also robbed a bank and they could not charge him with robbing a bank. So he was protected in that. So that was the context under which we established the restorative justice circle. So we, like I said, it was about mid-June that we had the circle, and we ended up having it at the Leon County Jail because it was easier to keep Connor there and bring us in. And then I think even though we said Connor could be there and we would walk in, they didn't bring Connor there until we were all there sitting in the room. And we brought in Father Michael Foley from Good Shepherd Church as the representative from the community. We had reached out to the domestic violence community in Tallahassee, but they did not return our call. I really wish that we could have had them there. Sujatha also, told us that they may not be prepared to come, which is great when you have an established program. We were flying by the seat of our pants. This had never been done in Leon County, and never had a murder case been have a restorative justice circle pre-adjudication. So it was, we were in very new territory with that. So they read the charges against Connor, and Father Michael opened with a prayer. And then Andy and I, they blocked off like 5 hours for the circle. And I thought, it's never going to take 5 hours. It took every bit of 5 hours. And we talked about Anne and her life and how much she meant to us, and what losing her meant to us, meant to our family. And we had a blanket that her friend had crocheted with some of her awards and things that were meaningful to her. And we were allowed to share with Connor the impact of what had happened in our life.
One of the things that I wanted out of the circle is I didn't know what had happened to Anne, because the last time I saw her was on Saturday night at 5 o'clock. And so one of the things that I wanted to hear was what happened. And so that was one of the things I wanted out of the circle. And so when it came to Connor's turn, he told me what happened exactly from that time on. And it didn't help me, because it was just a senseless tragedy of two young kids who got into arguments and just didn't have the proper tools or knew how to get out of it. And it just built up and built up until Connor said he just wanted it to end. And so he shot Anne. And it just made no sense to me, which, my wise wife had told me that it probably wouldn't make sense to me, but it did give me that sense. And part of the sense that it gave me was I realized that as a father, you're supposed to protect your children. And I felt some responsibility that I hadn't. And after listening to what Connor said, I knew that there was nothing I could have done. And so it satisfied me in that way too, that I felt like as a father, I'd done everything I could, and it was not something that I had lacked in doing. There was a certain time point when the details of it was very upsetting and very shocking. And I remember Jack Campbell, the state attorney at the time, said, he called a break and he pulled Kate and I aside and he said, I can end this right now. We told him, no, we don't want it to end. We don't want it to end. And he also told us that he would have increased the charges if he had known the details of what Connor had said. So the pre-plea conference was a very valuable tool on behalf of Connor's sake and for our sake, because in the end, it did give us what we needed. It satisfied us both. And we got to talk about the sentencing. That was a part of it too, that we got to talk about sentencing, but it was a little different ending than we thought.
Yeah, I personally, as Andy said, didn't think there would be anything that came out from Connor that would make any sense, or so I didn't need to know the details of what had happened. But what I was interested in was participating in the sentencing. And again, as I said, you know, if he was going to have to spend half his time behind bars, if he was going to have to, you know, be sentenced half the time behind bars, half the time in the community, making a difference. So when it came time to talk about sentencing, I suggested 5 years because that's what Jack Campbell said. But I said 5 to 10 years with 10 years of probation. And then Andy said 10 to 15 years with 10 years of probation. Michael and Julie said, we agree with the Gromers. And I thought, well, we didn't even agree with each other. And Connor basically said, my life is in your hands. At that point, Jack Campbell shut his book and said, I'm taking this back to my office and I'll see you later. That's not the ending that we expected. That's not the ending that restorative justice circles have in areas where they have agreements with the state attorneys. You know, the thought is that we would have all sat there and kind of worked on what was going to happen. And we would have all participated. So in that perspective, we were kind of left in shock, but I'll let Michael and Julie talk about their experience in the circle.
Well, as Professor Coker had mentioned earlier, preparation before circle is critical, and Sujatha spent a lot of time with Connor because his honesty would be crucial for the whole circle. And either the defense lawyer or the prosecutor had experience with restorative justice. So it was a learning curve for all of us. And to her credit, she did an amazing job. Over the phone, we actually none of us met Sujatha. There wasn't Zoom back then until she actually landed in Tallahassee from Oakland to be part of the circle. Michael, do you want to?
The context of holding the circle in the pre-plea conference allowed the discussion to fit into the confines of the judicial system and was unrestricted with the consequences. That has been mentioned a couple of times, and the important part from our perspective is that safe space mentioned before applies to the offender too. So in this pre-plea conference, it was a safe space for him to speak. It really freed him to deal with the immense reality of his crime. It made him state exactly what he did to those he most impacted, and then he had to hear what that impact had on those people. June 22nd, 2011, 10 years ago this week, we arrived at the jail and waited till we could all go through security together. We set up the room in a big circle, and as mentioned, we had mementos from Ann's world in the center of it, so she could be part of it too. The staff at Atlanta County Jail brought Connor in and unshackled him and allowed him to be in the room unattended. And as Kate mentioned, this is really poignant because this had to be specifically asked for because it was so against the standard procedure and outside the norm. At Sujatha's direction, Connor hugged his mom and then me, and then he hugged Kate and Andy.
It was the first time in more than a year that I was able to hug Connor. And there was so much emotion in that circle, so much honesty, and it was an incredible opportunity. The unique value of our circle was that everyone impacted had a voice and could be heard. Since Connor was over 18 when it happened, we, as his parents, did not exist in the judicial system. The community support that showed for mercy and reconciliation was not a factor. And there was the opportunity to state the impact of the tragedy on us and allow for, as Kate mentioned, lots of alternatives were proposed and considered. Even Katie, our childlike Katie, could contribute. She was, we recorded her talking about Connor and that he had done something bad to Anne and that he had consequences. To her, consequences are no television, no ice cream, no calling your friends. She talked about Anne and what a wonderful time Anne must be having up in heaven. So all of those are basic concepts that she can relate to and understand, but it's something that we can all learn from too. As I was sitting there in the circle, that long day, as Kate said, it was, that day of discourse was excruciatingly painful. It felt as if those cinder block walls of the jail would crumble under the emotion.
The Restorative Justice Circle was unknown to all of us. The prosecutor specifically told Connor, don't say this, don't tell anybody in the jail what we just went through, because he didn't want it replicated. And walking out with Greg Cummins, the defense attorney, he said, I didn't charge you enough.
But the restorative justice has had an immeasurable impact on Connor, speaking to what he did to the people he harmed the most. By his actions, provided him an opportunity for reconciliation and for healing. He took responsibility for his actions in a raw and a direct way, and the circle allowed him to address that burden. Connor has said that the circle is the hardest thing he's ever done, and that's from a man who's living in a men's prison.
Well, his actions will always be with him. The circle allowed Connor to move forward in a positive way. The challenge to him now of being incarcerated is a lesser focus than the challenge of staying connected to our community. From a community perspective, this is essential for when Connor is released, because he does not want to be a product of the prison community. He wants to know how to be a contributing member to our community. And the societal impact of the tragedy was spotlighted. The children's store that was missing their employee, Anne. The community theater missing 2 backstage workers. The special needs sister missing her brother and her newfound friend, Anne. The university missing 2 bright sparks.
People across the community were impacted by the harm, and in different ways. And for us, the circle highlighted this community impact. One community lost 2 young people in Connor's one terrible action. This young couple who were helping Katie on her 17th birthday party, they could have gone on to help change the world. And the harm of losing that is immeasurable. One evening, the Gromers and McBrides were speaking at E6 FSU's law and society class, and Connor called Kate. He often calls Kate and Andy on Tuesday nights. She put him on speakerphone, and off the cuff, he spoke to the class about restorative justice. And before the 15 minutes call was terminated, he made one last statement. He said, the value of Anne's life is worth more than my life in prison.
The positive impact of the circle was felt by all of us. We, the family of the offender, were included. The Gromers got answers the normal process would not have provided. The community was part of the process, and the impact of this tragedy to them was considered and discussed. We asked Connor what he would want us to tell people about restorative justice, and his answer was simply, tell them it works. Back to you, Kate and Andy.
Thanks, Michael. After the conference, pre-plea conference, the circle, the Restorative Justice Circle, Sujatha and Andy and I went out to dinner, and Sujatha asked us, she said, do you still forgive Connor? And I told her, I said, I'm gonna have to think about it. And I did think about everything that he said, you know, all those details. And every time I thought of something, I thought, well, you know, I have forgiven him for that. We didn't forgive Connor for his sake. We forgave Connor for our sakes. We have 2 other daughters. We both have jobs. We are still married to one another. And forgiving Connor allowed us to let go and not be tied down. Andy says all the time that if we had not forgiven him, then we would have gone to prison with Connor. And, you know, that's the thing about restorative justice is even without forgiveness, it allows the victim to sit across from the offender and tell them, you know, share with them the impact of the harm that they did. And I think it's incredibly helpful emotionally and psychologically for victims to have that and be able to state that and hear on the other side that that people that someone understands and gains empathy from what you said. I remember Connor saying, you know, he never thought about changing diapers, having to change Anne's diapers and feed her. And, you know, it's really kind of funny that what people hang on to in that conversation. But he also, you know, I also told him, I said, you have to do the good works of two people now, Connor. And he said, that stuck with him. He didn't say anything that day, but what I said really stuck with him about having to do the work of two people. And he's really taken that to heart. So after a few days, Jack Campbell did come back with two offers for Connor. One was 25 years straight, day for day, there's no time off for gun crimes, or 20 years straight with 10 years of probation, which included the three conditions that we wanted: that he speak about teen dating violence, that he take anger management classes, and that he volunteer in areas that Anne would have had she lived. We did not put any restrictions on that time that he would have to volunteer, because we knew that if we said 300 hours and he only did 290, then he could possibly face a return to prison. So we left that part open. After a while, not after a while, really, just after a couple of days, Connor accepted 20 years straight with 10 years of probation. I will say that, you know, it made me a little nervous, thinking that maybe Connor would take the 25 years. And then, you know, that was my part. You know, the part I wanted were those terms, those conditions of probation. And I just had to trust that if he had taken the 25 years, you know, just to be done with the criminal justice system 5 years sooner, that he still would have done that. And in that regard, over the past 11 years, Connor has taken anger management classes through the Department of Corrections. Connor has made a public service announcement, which is on the Florida Restorative Justice Association website, on teen dating violence. And while he has not volunteered in areas that Anne would have, because she was an animal advocate, she certainly didn't have a prison ministry, Connor has volunteered and taught and facilitated classes in the prison system for the past 11 years. And so he has taken to heart, and we have full faith that having this restorative justice circle made a difference for him, because it made him accountable for what he had done, and he took seriously the conditions of probation that we wanted for him. We do have two daughters. They chose not to participate in the restorative justice circle. Their experience, they're very private about their grief, and so they just didn't want to be very public about it. But they have both forgiven Connor in their own way, and they just want, that's their statement. And people often ask us, if Connor were a stranger, would this all have happened? You know, would we have sought restorative justice? And the only thing I can say is that I think we would have still been brought to forgiveness. And I would hope that instead of us having to, call and search and try and find somebody, that somebody would be offering that to us. And I think we would want to participate in that as well.
Yeah. I would add that I think that because of who Connor was, it was much more personal to me. And I think it was harder. I mean, I think it was harder to go through this walk. I think with a stranger, you can pretty much, you can forgive somebody, but you don't have to reconcile with them. And so I could have forgiven a stranger because I knew I didn't have to reconcile with them and be part of their life ever again. But with Connor, I kind of made that commitment to be part of his life. And he asked me one time, "What is it that you want, Mr. Gormere?" And I said, I want you to serve your sentence and have a happy life, married and kids, have a normal life. And I want you to be happy. That's what I want for you, Connor, because he's a person, and that's what people deserve. Kate says all the time, how would you like to be defined by the one mistake you made in your life? Whatever that might be. And somebody puts that title on you for the rest of your life, no matter what it is. And you can never let go of it. That's not who we are.
Yeah, if we make Connor a murderer, then that makes my daughter a murder victim. And that is how she died, but it's not how she lived. And because we've chosen not to give Connor that title and not simply define our daughter as a murder victim, people talk about her all the time. People call me Ann all the time. And I don't have to, it doesn't hurt me. I like that people can say your name and they're not afraid of how it's going to impact me. It really upsets me that so many victims are especially murder victim families are left in this place of sadness and stuck in their grief. We grieve. Don't think that we don't grieve. The holidays come up. It was, Father's Day just this past weekend. There is always an empty space. There's always someone missing from every picture we take. But we don't, we experience that grief, but we don't have to be stuck in that grief, and we can move on. So we have sad days and we cry, but we have a life, and we can also live.
Kelly, I think we're at the end.
I'm just looking to see if there's any additional questions. There's been a few questions in the chat, and I do want to thank you so much for talking to us today. I want to mention that the Gromeres have created a Be the Change Fund. It's a charitable fund to promote forgiveness and restorative justice practices under the Community Foundation of North Florida. And also Kate's book, Forgiving My Daughter's Killer, A True Story of Lost Faith and Unexpected Grace. It goes into a lot more detail. So please go ahead, and that's on Amazon if you want to read that. And also that Michael asked about that rule, and it's Rule 3.171, Florida Rules of Criminal Procedure. It's the Pre-Plea Agreement Conference. So in this case, that would apply. And there's a lot of case law on the protections that rule provides. Unlike mediation, I do want to say in Florida, mediation is not criminal matters, or there's no mediation for criminal matters in statute. That statute is for civil cases. So that needs to be changed in statute. But thank you so much. Is there any other questions in the Q&A right now? Do you see any, Professor, that you want to address? I want to thank Gretchen Casey, who's been answering some of the questions in the chat. She's the president of the Florida Restorative Justice Association. So thank you for that.
It was a question to give the title of the book one more time. And it's also in the materials that every attendee received.
Right. It's Forgiving My Daughter's Killer, A True Story of Loss, Faith, and Unexpected Grace. And our panelists, do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I would like just to say, one thing Michael and Julie talked a little bit about this, but remember, as the parents of the offenders, they're usually the silent people that never are heard. And restorative justice gives them the opportunity because, as I said earlier, they too had a loss, and they too are people and are deserving of having their voices heard. And restorative justice does that, and that is, one thing I always try to say, because usually the parents of the offender, usually people look at them and said, what did you do wrong? Why should you get to say anything? It's just not true.
Here's an important question that just came in. How do we donate to the Change Fund?
It's through the Community Foundation of North Florida. So they have a donation page. It's CNF
or something. Yeah.
CFNF.org. CN Community Foundation of North Florida, CFNF.org.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you again for sharing your personal journey and your case study on how restorative justice is used in serious harm cases, to really help all parties talk about it face to face, talk about the impact, and answer the 4 questions. What happened? Who is impacted and how? What needs to be done to make things as right as possible? And what things need to be done to make sure this never happens again. So thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, lawyers, they can reach out to me as well, Kelly at kellymcgrathlaw.com. I'm happy to talk about restorative justice and its use in Florida.
And our deep thanks to all of you for sharing your lives with us. We'll break, come back in 10 minutes for our final presentation.
Thank you, Scott.
Michael, we're not starting for another 5 minutes or so. Judge too, so you can keep the cameras off if you want.
Thanks. How you doing? How did it go today?
We're in front of 300 people, so everything's going great.
Great. I'm not going to say a word.
And-
All right. I'll see you in a few minutes.
It's all
Thanks.
right. It actually is going great.
Congratulations. I'm impressed how many people are still hanging in there.
Yep. See you soon.
Bye.
All right, welcome back for our final hour. A criminal justice system turns its lonely eyes to these fine gentlemen. We're going to present to you these kind folks and experts on the implementation, the practical application of restorative justice and its principles. Let me just briefly introduce them to you. Rob, are you around? Camera on. In alphabetical order, batting first.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Michael Becker is a veteran prosecutor and a veteran in the 8th Judicial Circuit out of Gainesville. He's a perfect partner for us in this discussion. If you haven't had a chance to read anyone's bio, if you had to read one bio, well, I'd read Judge Leifman's bio because it's more than impressive. You got to read Mike's bio as well. His phrase is going to be do what works. And we're going to you first, Michael, okay? So get ready. Rob Burrs, it's a privilege to have him with us. He is a leader in this field, an advocate for criminal justice reform across the nation, and the founder of Restorative Justice Diversified Services. Dean Galligani is a 30-year lawyer, former assistant public defender, currently a criminal defense lawyer in Gainesville, and is past president of the 8th Judicial Circuit chapter of FACDL, the Florida Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And these are the folks who are putting restorative justice into practice. And he's going to give you his special perspective coming up. And last but not least, our friend Judge Steve Leifman, who's in my home judicial circuit, I'm fortunate to say, is the Associate Administrative Judge in the Criminal Division for Miami-Dade County Court. And from day one, from being a judge, he has been at the forefront of judicial leadership in mental health, in homelessness, in opioid and other drug addictions, and just ways even to make the lawyers practicing in front of him, prosecuting and defending, to make their lives better and easier. And it trickles all the way down to the judicial staff and the clerk staff. Among the many awards you can read about that he has received is the Rehnquist Award for Judicial Excellence that Chief Justice John Roberts gave to him. And he's in magazines and articles and books and television all the time. Currently, he chairs the Florida Supreme Court Steering Committee on Problem-Solving Courts. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, my goal for our conversation is for us to be as concrete as possible, coming on the heels of the two magnificent segments that you are following. So let me start with Mr. Becker. You can't do any of this without the state. Why does restorative justice work from your perspective for Florida prosecutors? And we'll begin there about building these circles across the state.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that I think it's really going to depend on having the right case. There are times when the defense attorney wants to come in and do a restorative meeting instead of prosecution. And I don't think that any prosecutors are going to be interested in dropping the case if the defendant says they're sorry. I think that the times when we, as prosecutors, let me say I'm only speaking for myself, as prosecutors are going to want to do the restorative justice is when it's the best choice available. For example, Dean and I had a case where there's a relationship between the parties. And because of the facts of the case, there was no criminal prosecution result that was going to benefit either his client or the victims. And it was recommended that restorative justice could be an option. And so I looked at that, and the ability to have the relationship so that the person doing the crime and the person that's the victim of the crime have a better understanding of each other, so that they can both interact better with each other, I think is the best use of the restorative justice model.
Is it,
Yeah.
let me just ask you, is it better to ask you, given a particular case, what attracts you to consider restorative justice as a resolution model? Or is it easier to ask you from the other end reasons why cases that do not, in your opinion as a prosecutor, lend themselves to this process?
I think I'm looking for two things. One, that the victim is going to be better off. And two, that the defendant isn't going to reoffend. Because if we have a situation, oh, go ahead.
To your first point, what goes into that calculus, and all of you will be able to weigh in on this, that the victim will be better off, in your opinion, if you go down this road. Why and how? What goes into that decision?
The victim would be better off if it's going to solve an ongoing problem, because as we all know, the vast majority of times, the defendant is either going to be out in a relatively brief period of time, or the defendant is going to have friends or associates that are going to take the place of the defendant. So if we can solve the underlying problem that the victim faces, whether it's an ongoing dispute between two groups, which we have an increase of currently, or if it's an offense where the defendant isn't going to be incarcerated for long enough to protect the victim, that the change in the defendant's behavior makes it worthwhile.
Okay, let me harp on that last point for a moment. If the incarcerative term is not going to be long enough to protect the victim, let's engage restorative justice. Could you expand on that for a moment?
Sure. I'm really glad that there are victims that are able to come to peace with what happened and are able to forgive the person. I don't know that most victims are able to do that in more significant cases. I think that we can see if the victims are willing to do it, but I don't know that that's going to be an easy thing. When we have prior relationships, I think it's a lot more likely. The case study that we just heard about, that's very exceptional.
Meaning that if that case had been brought to you or assigned to you with a request to explore that, again, you're only speaking for yourself. You're not speaking for your state attorney.
Correct.
Or the ASA in the office next to you, right? Because ultimately we need to talk about the buy-in, and we're starting with you as a state stakeholder. You might have handled that case in a different fashion.
Well, to me, the victim's position is very, very, very important. And if the victim comes in and they say, I want closure, and that means we get the maximum prosecution we can obtain, that opinion means a lot to me. If the victim comes in and all the other facts are the same, and the victim says, to me, closure is understanding what happened and not having to live with, not knowing or live with the anger, because I fully understand that, the anger that a person feels towards somebody that commits the crime is destructive to the person that feels the anger.
Well, are you taking your entire cue from the victims or their representatives? Because if you're not even just open to, but if you're not looking for the possibility of restorative justice practice for a case resolution, then it's not going to happen.
Right. To me, I would say that it's more than half of what of what I'm going to do is going to be what the victim wants. Because the other considerations are, what are the facts of the case? If you have a case and the evidence doesn't support the victim's desire for maximum potential incarceration, then you have to have a conversation with the victim about, I understand that you want the maximum incarceration. These facts aren't going to support it. And so we need to make a lesser offer to resolve this case. But that's, I think, a different discussion than with victims that want to have healing for themselves as their primary focus instead of punishment. Because that's kind of like the two pulling factors for the case.
Would you say that sentiment in and of itself, from the victim's perspective, no matter the degree of severity of the crime, is unusual? That a victim comes to you and says, "That's how I want to handle it. I'm not into the punishment aspect of it."
I would say a substantial minority of the victims are really in the, we're not looking for blood. To me, surprising number of the victims will come in and say, this person did something horrible to, our relative, but the same thing that, this defendant did could have been done by someone else. It's
all right. Well,
I'll give you an example. DUI manslaughter cases.
Right.
A fair number of the defendants in the DUI manslaughters are individuals that know the victims, because the victims are somebody that's in the car with them, or they have an underlying addiction problem. I think that the restorative justice status currently is a lot like the drug court status 20 or 30 years ago. It takes a demonstration of its usefulness for other people to adopt it.
Okay, so with that, let me go to Rob. How do you get the state attorney's offices, as a matter of office policy, as a primary stakeholder, to buy into this?
In that last case study, the Grossmeyers, their particular stance and how they handled this case was exactly how it should be done. That was a textbook example of how restorative justice can work. So I want to commend them, and it was very humbling to hear their story.
I've read your material. You're about agency leadership and the investment of the stakeholder, giving yourself the time to do this right,
correct,
opening up the lines of communication to do this well, and then all the steps of implementing a system that fosters this. So
that's correct. And getting into that, for the prosecutors, they are first on the board. If you do not have the prosecutors on board with this process, it will not work. Well, I shouldn't say it will not work. It'll be difficult for it to work.
Right. How do you get that?
Letting them know that this process can be opened at any point during the criminal justice system, and is not a way for people who have been accused of a crime, or even who admit to the crime, that they're getting off scot-free. I think that that's the area of contention that many people believe, that, I'll use this term, people use hug-a-thug. They think that we are going to take the defendant or the person that's accused and give them a free break from the criminal justice system by letting them go if they want to admit that they did something wrong, apologize to the victim, and then do X amount of community service hours or take some courses. Restorative justice goes much deeper than that. So you need to explain the process to the prosecutors.
What is it about?
I'm sorry?
What is it about restorative justice that
It is
works
full
so
accountability.
well, that works so well that we need way more of it?
It is full accountability coming from the person who did that harm and interacting with the victim, the person that where that harm was done. You're bringing two people together so that you can repair something that was done that was wrong. You're repairing that breach of the relationship. Even if the people didn't know each other, there was a break between the community, there was a break between the law. And part of this process really is bridging that gap. The offender, the person accused, is going to come home, plain and simple. Most of them will eventually come home. Their families still live there. There will be animosity amongst family, friends, or colleagues, so to speak. And that's going to be across the board. We don't want that. This process allows people to have a dialogue, come to some type of consensus and agreement. And even the victims can have a stake, as they did in that last case study, of what they feel the offender or the person that was accused, what they need to do in order to make it right for them. I don't like using the word closure, but it's a way for them to have a direct stake inside of, as they mentioned, the sentencing, which is one thing I truly do believe in the restorative process, is not just a victim impact statement that is read from a podium at sentencing. No, this is a process where they are deeply weaving in reparations that they want to see this person do. And quite simply, many people want to see the offender get better.
Okay,
They don't
so
want to see someone languishing in prison forever and learning nothing from this process.
So what would you like to see, having seen this work all over the country, as the inroad to our state attorney's offices in our different judicial circuits, as to either introduce them to the concept or fortify the concept and give them an idea of the structures that need to be in place to get this going?
Our constitutional system allows for changes inside of our laws, especially at the state level. And we need to be more robust in the state of Florida in order to make that happen. I use this often. I mean, I come from a problem-solving court background with the drug courts, DUI courts, and mental health courts. I also have that as a background as well. And Florida was the leader of it. Florida started it all. So I'm currently living in a state that was the front runner of looking at things from a problem-solving court and looking at it from a community service dynamic, not community service through the work, but community service as far as repairing and looking at the underlying issues on why someone committed a crime. And so when you look at the problem-solving model, you can somehow weave in aspects of restorative justice. I'm not saying bridge the two programs. What I'm saying is look at the similarities there. Florida recognized that they needed to do something with people who were habitual drug users and abusers. And so they made a change inside of the court systems. That is how restorative justice needs to be looked at. We need to look at changing legislation so that restorative justice will be an option for the state's attorneys and the circuit courts to look at for each case. Now, it doesn't mean that restorative justice is going to be used in each case. However, the educational components around it, the training and the education of professionals to include community members, as well as the victims and the offenders to understand what this concept is about, will open up doors for healing as well as reconciliations.
It is not likely, though, that we're going to get the kind of legislative movement that we need unless you have the state as a partner going to Tallahassee with you. So let me ask Judge Leichman. Dean, you're on deck.
Sure.
All right. So from the practical, Judge, to the theoretical, to the statistical, you know all the numbers. Why are you here today? Why is this important to you? Why does it work? What's missing from our systems? And concretely, how do we move forward? Go.
The principles of restorative justice are incredibly effective if we want to reduce recidivism and we want to stop the recycling. So let's think of it a little differently. The United States has 4% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's inmates. We have the largest per capita of inmates in the United States. We incarcerate more people here than anywhere else in the world. We spend over $1 trillion a year in direct and indirect costs. 1 out of every 115 adults in the United States before the pandemic were behind bars, and 1 out of every 38 adults in the United States were under correctional supervision. So we have a problem. Another way to look at this is that 70% of the people in the criminal justice system today either have a serious mental illness, a substance use disorder, or both. In some ways, we almost need to have a specialty court for the 30% that don't have a mental health or substance use disorder and figure out how to deal with them and convert our system to deal with the vast majority, to use restorative justice principles to get them treatment so they stop recycling through the system. We don't accomplish a whole lot today with the way that we do things. It is out of whack and it is ineffective. It's expensive. People are hurt. I mean, both victims and defendants, and we're not getting to some of the core issues. And so what
might you articulate from your point of view how we are not aligned well now with meting out the best kind of justice we're capable of?
Classic example. And you know, let's put this in perspective. Most of the cases we see are not violent crimes. They do fit into a different category and need to be treated differently. And I think we need to recognize that. There are probably a few instances where victims may be okay for some type of restorative justice meting out, but you're not going to see a lot of that in a very violent offense. And I'm not sure in some cases it should be done. But that's not the majority or even close to the majority cases we see. And so we have a system that was designed a couple hundred years ago, not for people with mental health and substance use disorders, but that's what we're stuck with. That is the de facto world that we have today, is that our system is primarily people with these disorders and their illnesses. And so we've applied a criminal justice model for 200 years. And now that we have so many people with these illnesses in our system, it's failing and it's failing miserable. And the same people keep coming back again and again and again. It's not like we have accomplished something and so we have stopped, or we've improved public safety, improved the spending of critical taxpayer dollars by doing what we were doing. And so we know through evidence and research that principles like restorative justice help stop the recycling, help the victim heal, which is what we want to see. And there's different kinds of victims. I mean, you have a community victim and you have an individual victim, right? I say, and I'll give you another example, another area where restorative justice needs to be applied is in traffic. In Dade County, we have almost 600, actually, we have more than 600,000 people with suspended licenses. Who are the victims? Everyone in Dade County that drives. Why? Because our insurance rates are through the roof, because we have almost a third of the people with a suspended license here, right? So adjudicating those cases, slapping them on the hand, putting them in the jail, is that helping anybody get their license back? Is that helping anybody get our insurance rates down? You know, is that helping improve relationships with certain communities and law enforcement? No. And so applying these kinds of principles could help us get what we want. We should help people, you know, get their licenses back. We just did a zip code analysis, right, in Miami-Dade, looking at these cases. And in zip codes where the poorest people in Dade County live, they have the most infractions in cases, right? In some zip codes, you have almost a ticket for every person that lives in the zip code. So something's out of balance in these systems.
So might you envision, like we have drug court and veterans court and mental health court or a homelessness court? Are we looking for institutionalization of this in a restorative justice court? Should it be policy, if adopted by a given state attorney, that's one of the options that's always discussed in the appropriate case with the victim or their...
So I think we need to be a little more sophisticated and nuanced. And I think that we need to have a system that has an ability to figure out who needs what when they come in. And so if the person has a serious mental illness with a low risk of criminogenic factors, they should go down one path, probably be diverted into a civil system and out of the criminal system completely. Then you may have another category of people, say, that come into our system that have a serious mental illness, but they have a lot of criminogenic risk factors. They're going to need a different level of treatment and attention to keep them from reoffending.
Diversion, though, as a function of state prerogative. Why would
I actually would make it legislative prerogative so that we stop overburdening the system and make sure the right people get treatment.
Well, this is interesting, Judge, right? Because why would the executive branch cede all the power and authority that the Supreme Court has given them since our founding to be the ones who are responsible for making the charging decisions, including diversion? Why would they give that up for restorative justice?
Because it's not working. You know, what did Einstein say? You keep doing the same thing again and again and you expect a different outcome. That's the definition of insanity. Well, that's our system today.
Well,
so if you want to be part of insanity and not stop the merry-go-round and figure out what works better, then let's just keep doing it. But it's expensive. We have more and more victims, not less. And we don't have a restorative justice system that makes people whole and that stops people from reoffending. And I think we'd all be happy if we created a system that would do that.
So Dean, you're the criminal defender in the group right now. You've put this into practice. You've seen it work. You've been with us for the afternoon. Why, from a global perspective, is not just this the right thing for your clients in those cases, but for everyone in the system from your viewpoint?
Well, I think exactly what the judge just said. What we're doing now doesn't work. And the only way to change it is to have a legislative.
What does that mean exactly? We spend too much money on pretrial incarceration. Our bond systems are messed up. The criminal punishment code isn't reflective of reality. What's not working?
If you don't mind, if you don't mind my jumping in for a moment, one of my fellow prosecutors told a story about he prosecuted 3 different generations of the same family. You know, he had the grandfather when he was a young prosecutor, then he had the son, and then he was an old prosecutor who was prosecuting the grandson.
Which means what?
It means that we aren't doing anything to address the underlying problems. You know, the drug addiction and why drug court works is they're not talking to people about you use drugs, that's bad. They're talking about why do you use drugs? We went to an addiction model instead of a purely criminal model for the drug use. If we can address the relationship issues that are underlying the criminality for a lot of the actions, then that will be more effective than if we just punish the person for the bad relationship that they have with society.
Right.
Michael, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So Dean, how have you gotten this to work for you in the past?
Well, I think you were bringing up the part of the overall. It forces offenders to really look at themselves like in no other way. It's, you know, at a sentencing, we could prepare mitigation. We could do an apology that's 9 months or a year later that nobody takes seriously. In the restorative justice cases I've had, the defender really has to take a look at themselves because they're going to be asked tough questions. They're going to be face to face. It could take hours, if not days, to resolve. It's not a 15-minute sentencing where your attorney presents most of the mitigation on your behalf. And so in the cases I've had, we always do, a mental health evaluation, a substance abuse evaluation, whatever the issue is. And that person, for the first time in their life, really has to take account of where they stand and how they're not just affecting the victim, but their families, their neighbors, their community. And that in and of itself makes that person take account and change their behavior.
Wouldn't an accused, realizing that this could be a benefit for them in the long run, just fake their way through the process?
They'd have to be really good at faking. And most offenders
Why?
Why? Because it's heart-wrenching at times. It's honest, it's brutally honest, and there's no escape. You're face to face, and you're going to be confronted with things, and you can't just run away like you have most of your life. And whether that's running and using drugs or running literally from your home, this is something where you sit face to face with somebody that you've harmed. And before we get to that process is a process of really learning a lot about yourself. And to me, the impact that it's had on my clients is more than just resolving their case in their favor. We don't even look at it in their favor. It's a resolution of many things in their life at one time. And the impact of those people, I hear from them like no other clients that this has been a life-changing thing for them. And I hear from them just thanking me for getting them into the process. And I'm always like, well, I didn't invent this process. I've just seen how valuable it is. So those are from a defense perspective, there's no way to fake your way through this, particularly when I have cases, and the last case I had was with Michael. He's there. He's not going to let anybody get away with that. And just in our case, he asked tough questions also. So I really think it requires an introspection like no other place in the system gives them.
So Rob, in order to alter the culture, as I have heard you phrase it, practically, this is for you and Judge Leifman, the things that need to be done practically to implement restorative justice, not just hitting or missing. You're lucky a case gets assigned to Michael, and if he thinks it's appropriate, he's open to the suggestion. He's educated in it. He's knowledgeable because he's done it before, right? What percentage of your colleagues, without outing anybody in particular, know about restorative justice and are into it also as a means for game-changing criminal justice?
For me, it's pretty much the majority of the people in my circle.
Well,
because
hold on one second, Rob. Hold on
Yes.
one second, Michael.
Sure.
That's going to be a very, very small percentage. If you want to,
Why aren't you running down the hallways saying, "Hey, this works"?
no, it doesn't always work. But if you want to encourage the prosecutor to give it serious thought,
Right.
talk to them about looking at it like a proffer. The advantage from the prosecutor's perspective, even if the evidence can't be used in the state's case in chief, is it gives the state an insight to what the defendant would do. And so your prosecutors that are in it for the victory of the case are much more likely to look at that as a chance to know what the defendant would say. The other thing that I would urge when you talk to the prosecutor is tell them that it's not, you do this and the charges get dropped. There is still punishment. There is going to be a change in the way that the defendant acts. And that change can be enforced either through probation or PTI or other punishments.
Yeah.
And so it's not you do this and then you walk home free. There are consequences from the restorative justice because half of the phrase is justice.
So Rob, with your
Yes.
training background and expertise, do you ever have to get the organization to want the training, or when folks have come to you, they're hungry for it, so they're more
You have to
receptive?
get them to want the training, and then you have to stay in their face every single month. Really, you have to hold 1 month retrainings and trying to get everybody in there. Last time I did it with the last DA's office in 2 locations. In Colorado Springs was the first one, but then the second one was in Santa Barbara County. We had to do open house trainings for the prosecutor's office multiple times over months to include leading up into a year, and it was reoccurring. And we had people going to workshops and restorative justice 101s. We had to explain the process over and over again. I'm going to take another step back, looking at what Judge was saying, as well as with Michael, when you're looking at the circles of support. The prison system was initially set aside for people to go through penance, sit back, reflect upon what you did that was wrong, and you go through like a prayer and meditation type period. That was the original system from the Quakers. And we got away from that. Why? And you really have to ask yourself why. And how come we don't do more type of reforms where the offender, the accused, has to really look at what they did that was wrong? Restorative justice takes more of a standpoint of the person has to reflect upon what they did and own it. Howard Zare, he's a Mennonite. That primary principles around this entire process follows from the Puritans, the Quakers, and a Mennonite process. That's
Howard
the same thing that the prosecutors want.
Howard Zare, the author of the book.
The grandfather of, yes,
Okay.
grandfather of restorative justice, the changing lenses. So what I'm getting at is you're looking at it from a theoretical standpoint, but it's a human standpoint. You are having people come together to right a wrong. And any prosecutor who wants to see justice for the victim, because restorative justice is a victim-focused process. It's not a program. It is a victim-focused process. Any prosecutor who wants to see the victim become whole would want to entertain this as an idea. At the very minimum, to give that as an option for the victim is not, you're not giving a carrot for the offender. Most offenders who do not want to participate, once they understand what they have to go through, so admit what they did was wrong. 2, face the victim front on, along with the victim circles of support. And if the offender wants the accused, their circles of support in the room too. So you can't run from it. Just like we were mentioning, you have to face it, and you can't hide from that. And also, other
Judge
is they have a circle of support. The people that are in that room are there to support all parties. There's a vested interest inside the individual becoming better, becoming whole. It's not the system changing the person, it's their community changing them. They're accountable to the people that are in the room with them. That holds a much greater standpoint than anything that you could do as a system.
Yeah, I just want to follow up to Robert's point, because I think it's the most critical thing that people outside of our system don't understand and don't appreciate. In many ways, defendants feel that at some level they're getting away with no matter what they've done, even when they're punished, because they never come face to face to what they did. They continue to hide behind their issue, whether it's behind bars, whether it's after their CTS, or it's whether they're on probation. And so they've never dealt with it. This forces them. This is harder than prison for some people, to have to face what they actually have done and why they're doing what they're doing and getting help for it. And when you add that element to it, that's what helps break the cycle. Not by putting them in jail necessarily so they can hang out and pretend that they got away with it and brag at a weird level, but by actually having that heart-to-heart understanding and feeling a little bit more whole, and then they can move on in their own lives. That never happens in our existing system.
And so I would imagine you would recommend it in juvenile court as well, or even especially.
Especially. I mean, I also think we should step back before that, because we know a lot today that we didn't know 10 years ago. So what do we know? We know that 92% of all the women in jail and prisons in the United States with serious mental illnesses have these horrific histories of trauma, mostly sexual abuse as children. We know that 75% of men in jails and prisons today in the United States with serious mental illnesses also have horrific histories of trauma as children, usually sometimes sexual abuse, but usually victims of domestic violence or witnesses to really violent crimes. These are physiological reactions in the brain when you are involved in those kinds of things. So we should be doing something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience Assessment Tools, for every middle school in America. We should be capturing the trauma early and getting people treated before we have to get to needing a restorative justice model and keep them from ever committing a crime to begin with. We don't do any of that, or very little of it, in this country. There's movements But all of this needs to be together if we're going to get to the root and if we're going to actually crack the problem.
Now, when you say together, do you mean a coordinated effort on our part to advise Florida in its many compartments what needs to be done and why this needs to be done and what the result will be, or are you speaking to something else?
No, exactly that. And I think we need to probably alter or improve, reform some of our legal education systems. We should be teaching restorative justice and some of these other principles in law school so that Michael isn't an outlier, but he is typical. And really making this, a norm, not an exception. And
what about in judicial college?
It should be in judicial college. It should be in public defender training, National District Attorney Association training, everywhere. And it's not that way. And so what happens is a really good guy like Robert or Michael or Dean have taken it upon themselves to learn this and teach it, but it's so limited, we're not able to get it embraced at a larger.
Right, so it's spreading on literally an incremental case by case, hit or miss kind of basis.
Correct.
Unfortunately, yes.
We're being asked, by the way, in the questions, can we give some concrete examples of some types of cases where you've been involved or seen restorative justice principles work, and what were some of the tough questions that were asked and confronted in those circles, in those meetings? Gentlemen?
I could say that the case that we were just recently speaking about was quite public, quite toxic. Neighbors that had been feuding for years and years, if not over a decade, forced my client, who was a PhD professor, to look at some of his mental health issues that he had never addressed before. And those were the tough questions that he was getting, is what is he going to do from now on to address those things so we don't have this recurring problem that was going on for years and years and years. I also had one with battery on law enforcement officer, where a young lady who was a student here at University of Florida had never come to grips with her mental illness. And so she had to deal with that. And I find that before we even got to restorative justice, there were so many questions they had to answer about why they did what they did, that when we actually had the meeting.
To whom, Dean?
By their therapist or whoever's doing the evaluation, and then by me when I get the evaluation.
So you've been in these circles. We've all been in court when we've seen some magical, majestic moments of real justice being done. I'm getting a sense from you that those moments are more likely than not happening in those circles.
I'll give you an example. We had a woman in custody, serious mental health issues, very problematic, very bright. And I brought her up to the bench because I always, these are personal, tough issues. You're in an open courtroom. And I asked her if she would be more comfortable talking to us, the lawyers, prosecutor and defender, and me at the bench, because she didn't want to bare her soul in front of a bunch of strangers. And she came up and I said to her, I understand that most of the women who are in jail with mental health issues may have really horrible histories of trauma and sexual abuse. And all of a sudden she started crying like I had never seen. And she went on to tell us that she was first raped at 4. And she had never told anyone that in her life. We were the first people that she had admitted that issue to. The breakthrough for her at that moment was stunning. We were able to then get her from there and into treatment, which she had been refusing, and actually into recovery. But if you just, throw her away or lock her up or don't deal with some of those underlying issues, nothing is going to change. And it's heart-wrenching and it's difficult. It's difficult for us to have to listen to it sometimes, but for the people going through it, it's just, you wouldn't believe how difficult it is. They're not just bad people. They're sick people that have done bad things, and there's usually a reason. And when you can figure it out and get them the treatment that they need, you can stop it from happening again.
So, Judge, you've been, in terms of talking about moving forward, so you've been in charge of basically everything. You're the czar of this or that. And Rob, you've been at the forefront of trying to, move mountains to show
20
people
years now.
this can work, right? So what needs to happen? Is it statewide? Is it judicial circuit wide? Are these Florida bar appointments? What there needs, it seems from my perspective, listening to you, we need some kind of internal Florida report beyond OPAGA from folks in the know on the ground who said, listen, here's all the data you need. Here's what it's going to take. Here's where it's appropriate. Here's what it's going to cost. Here's what it might save.
We have it.
Are you willing to try it out with us? What is that
Florida
infrastructure
Restorative
look
Justice
like?
Association. We already have organizations that have been set up to look at these very things. And inside of this state, we just need to help it mature and actually use the circuits that are interested in restorative justice to push it through. FRJA is there, and we're not utilizing it the way that we should. We're not supporting it the way that we should. We're lending the credibility of the members that are already there. We have boots on the ground already with that organization.
That's my question, Rob. If
Mhm.
that is the conduit, the association already formed, we still need the infrastructure to get people to it, to educate them to it, to buy in. That's the infrastructure I'm talking to the four of you about now in the few minutes that we have left. All right, so moving forward, what do you want to leave everybody with?
Work with inside of your local circuits. I was able to be a part of the movement to move this restorative justice focus forward in the state of Colorado by working at my local level first. So in Colorado, I was at the 4th Judicial District. So the DA at the time was willing to look at it from a post-plea, pre-sentence standpoint. He wanted to find some type of middle ground in which the RJ process could work. And if there was a failure point anywhere in that system, he still didn't run out of time to go forward with the traditional way of meting out those charges in the justice system. So we worked specifically with inside that small area of time in order to see that this process worked inside of this judicial district, and it did. So once we got that buy-in, we were able to expand the services throughout that district and then share that information throughout the state at conferences, as well as just through white papers. And it worked in that regard to where Colorado has been able to pass legislation quite robustly based on that one little step forward. So the same process can be done here. Pick a circuit that's willing to take that leap and use the programs that are currently inside of that area and use them as a test study to move forward. It takes small incremental steps in order to get the bigger group to say, we have nothing to lose, let's give it a shot. Really, that's what it's gonna have to boil down to. Or a bold prosecutor to say, I'm gonna stake my neck on this thing and say, let's make it work, as well as having good law enforcement background and monitoring from a community-based organization. It can be done, and you can have the safeguards in place. You just have to be willing to set it up.
I would imagine, Joe, and I'm not holding you to knowing these numbers, but if I asked you across our judicial circuits, how many of them have drug courts? How many of them have mental health courts? That we would know that that's quantified. But if we asked one another, how many of our judicial circuits are practicing restorative justice principles, I don't know if we know that.
40 programs in the state.
I'm sorry?
I said, I've known about 40 programs in the state. I don't know how many of them are actually operational, like doing cases, having relevant cases, but 40 groups are listing themselves as restorative justice based.
Groups, what does that mean?
If you go onto the FRJA website, Florida Restorative Justice Association, you will see people that are using restorative justice inside of those circuits as practitioners. But Your Honor, please, I'm looking at it from a problem-solving court model. I think that might be a better way to look at the question and answer the question that Scott's talking about.
Well, in our last 2 or 3 minutes, we'll go in alphabetical order. Michael, what do you want to leave everybody with? In particular, I'm sorry to keep dumping this on you, my friend, all of your prosecutor colleagues, of which I'm a former one, right? What do you want to leave them with? because there are a couple hundred on the line now. A couple thousand Florida lawyers are going to see this over the course of the next 18 months.
If what you're doing isn't getting the results you want, you either have to change what you're doing or you're going to keep getting the results you don't want.
What does that mean? A result, because from
might.
the state attorney's perspective, that might be one thing, but from a line ASA might be another perspective.
Well, the line ASA needs to resolve their cases in a way that their supervisor finds acceptable. If the victim is happy with the case, that comes a long, long way toward making the supervisor happy with the result. So if you look at a case and you say, hey, this might be a type of situation where the defendant isn't someone that we're going to be able to incarcerate long enough to solve the problem, which is the vast majority of the cases. If the victim is going to be better off with essentially a real healing process, an apology with actions, not just I feel bad, drop my charges, but an apology with consequences.
Like every prosecutor's office should have a conviction integrity unit as they're spreading across the state. Should this principle, restorative justice, be emphasized similarly in degrees appropriate within each state attorney's office? So at least you all know about it.
I think it's like drug court 20 years ago. The results will speak for themselves. And when you see that it works, it will grow itself.
Okay. Rob, 1 minute parting thought.
Read up, just Google restorative justice and look at the basic tenets and foundations of the practice of restorative justice. Read Howard Zer's work, Gordon Bazemore. Gordon's out of Florida International University. He's local. There's a wellspring of local practitioners in the state of Florida. Look it up and just understand what the basics are around the process of restorative justice and educate yourself. I use restorative justice in the home and in my neighborhood with my children and their friends. It's not something that you just use inside the legal system. It's a total way of thinking. And I used to be on the law enforcement side. I was not a fan of restorative justice. My chief made me do it in 1998, and I became a convert in 2000. That's when I came to it. I was like, wow, this makes sense. But I was not for this process because it didn't make sense to me until I read about it and I put it in practical applications of how could this be used in my community? Make it real.
Dean.
Well, almost all the cases I've had to bring the idea up of restorative justice. And, His Honor and Robert are dealing with system-wide huge changes and talking about legislation. But rather than looking at it as convincing the prosecutors to whether they should bring it up or not, victim rights have changed so much. Shouldn't every victim be told about this when they're consulted right from the beginning? Shouldn't they be told that this is an option and not just on a case-by-case basis ad hoc at the prosecutor's discretion? And I think that would go a long way.
Are you suggesting whether law enforcement or state attorney, victim advocates, it's in the pamphlet that you get, that these are options for you as the victim?
Right. Until we get that widespread change and we convince everybody how successful this is, at least some percentage of victims, if they see this, read about it, or told about it, are going to maybe be inquisitive and say, what's this all about? And how will this affect my case? And how will this help me? So I think that's a short step we can take immediately and get some more of this going.
And Judge, I imagine this is going to get assigned to you by somebody eventually. So listen, you don't have enough jobs.
Exactly. Well, first of all, Scott, thank you for doing this. It was really amazing.
No, this is Yasik. I'm just here to help.
Good job. But the first thing I was to leave with is to know that the current system doesn't work. And I think Dean makes a great point, because I'm always pleasantly surprised when we do have victims involved in our cases. that they're the first ones that want to see the person get better, because they know if the person gets treated, they're not going to re-offend. And I think if we offered it as an option, it would take the pressure off the prosecutor to do more of this, and we would see this become more typical than atypical. So I think Dean's suggestion is a great one, and I would encourage that. And I think we need to start adding it as a judicial education piece and start introducing it to our colleagues and look at ways that we can make this, more of a systematic change as opposed to individual change.
Well, we are extremely grateful for the four of you and for all of our presenters and discussion facilitators today. That's the end of our program, but this conversation will go on and must go on. Your course number has been 4970, and the CLE certificate has been corrected to reflect the proper time span that your credit is good for. We hope you learned something. We hope you've been motivated and inspired in new ways and are willing to help us keep this conversation going. Are the four of you willing? If someone wants to reach out to you and ask a question or two to your publicly available emails, is that cool?
That's fine.
Absolutely.
And I think,
Except for you, Scott.
and Scott, you should have a radio station. That's the other thing I learned today.
Well,
You're good at this.
we're here to really, and this was Yasik's dream, who opened the show, and all the fine people that he corralled, to put restorative justice and its principles in motion and practice. So it's been our privilege to serve you on behalf of all of us at your ADR and criminal law and government lawyer sections. And on behalf of the Florida Restorative Justice Association, thank you for being with us. Keep on keeping safe, and we'll see you soon.
Great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Good
Appreciate it.
luck.
Thank you.